Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, and I am, as usual, your host, Steve. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Joran and William at the Alexandria level and Paul the Magnificent at the Constantinople level. Thank you to all of you who have signed up for Patreon. Our newly relaunched Patreon is a great way to support the show and really just keep this whole operation going. You can follow the link in the show notes or simply search for History of the Papacy podcast on Patreon to find more. One of the great new benefits you will receive on Patreon is the audio of the YouTube video only series, The History of the Papacy in 10 minutes. You can watch them by subscribing on my YouTube channel, The History of the Papacy podcast, and then you can listen to them on the Patreon bonus feed. Look for those episodes to premiere on YouTube soon. So thank you to everyone who listens out there. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife was touted as a document that could have changed the world and the entire way that the Christian church operated. We've learned that the premise, or more accurately, the hype of the document could never have meant anything like that in reality. Our goal today is to discuss some of the elements and some of the incentives and disincentives that caused this whole mess of a situation. And who better to talk and think us through this as a trained academic economist, cadaver synod aficionado, and writer for the American Institute for Economic Research, Max Gulker. Max, thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve, for having me. And this has to be the least of all the messes I've been on to discuss between the cadaver synod and the Black Death. But incentives and messes is something I traffic in. So let's give this a go.
Yeah, we'll give people a chance to think of how messy this is compared to some of those other messes. Now, you need no introduction for anybody who listens to the show, but for anybody who's new, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this topic of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife?
Absolutely. So I am an economist and senior research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research. I finished my PhD about 10 years ago at Stanford, worked in the private sector on litigation for a lot of years. I am a trained academic economist. I fled academia very quickly, but wound up in later years here at AIER, doing a lot of writing, a lot of kind of one foot in research and one foot in kind of talking to the public. As an economist, I'm not a trained historian, but I've always been a big fan of history, so to speak. Always been one of my interests, very interested in history podcasting as we've been connected. And this topic really combines sort of many things I love, including technology, communication technology, both old and new, along with religious history and Christian history, which we can talk about a little later. Sort of this got me thinking about my interest in that.
Okay, now let's start off with a little bit of the context and background. We won't be able to dig into it entirely, but I'm going to try and do this as quickly as I possibly can so that we can really get into the meat of what we're going to discuss today, is which to really delve in some of the incentives and the maybe wider focus issues today, but there's a lot to get into. So I'll get right into kind of summarizing the context of the story. The International Congress of Coptic Studies does not usually make waves in mass media or popular culture, But at the group's 2012 meeting in Rome, unbeknownst to most of the attendees, Harvard professor Karen King, who is also the Hollis Chair of Divinity at Harvard, one of the oldest endowed chair in all of U.S. academia, had a big announcement planned in conjunction with her scheduled lecture. Among the small handful of people who did know what was coming were reporters from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Smithsonian Magazine. They were given exclusive access to King with front page articles ready to go live. Back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard waited to launch a special new website of its own. King announced the discovery of an ancient papyrus fragment about the size of a business card or a credit card with text written in the Coptic language that appeared to be a part of a previously undiscovered gospel. This would have been enough to constitute a professional bombshell for those attending the conference, including scholars who had spent their entire careers researching non-canonical gospels, such as the Gnostic Gospels. We've discussed them in detail in several episodes, so you'll know something about them, and I would suggest going back and listening to them, and I think we still might have some episodes about the Gnostic Gospels because they're really an endlessly fascinating place to delve into. The immediate media frenzy, however, was to be focused on one particular faded and fragmentary line of the text. King translated it as such. Jesus said to them, "My wife." It's difficult to imagine a few ancient words written on a papyrus better placed in terms of content and timing to generate public interest in early Christian studies and Karen King herself. Her work had long approached the non-canonical early Christian texts, such as the Gnostic Gospels, with the thesis that the groups ultimately marginalized by the Orthodox or the Proto-Orthodox had differing and more egalitarian views towards women and sexuality and that sort of thing, which we know from a lot of the episodes that the Gnostics, that's really not quite how lines up with what the Gnostics actually said and with their dualistic beliefs, but that's a different topic for a different day. Anyway, King had even done considerable research on people like Mary Magdalene well before Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code. If you'll remember, Scott Rank and I in Hollywood Hates History tackled the Da Vinci Code movie, and I even had to defend it, so we'll stick with that. Nearly a decade later, King appeared eager to kind of nip the media hysteria surrounding the papyrus fragment in the bud. She reminded interviewers that discovery was not direct evidence the historical Jesus had a wife, let alone that a known figure like Mary Magdalene was the wife in question. Then again, she had also taken to calling the fragment the Gospel of Jesus' wife, indicating a kind of desire to ride the media hype. And even though that fragment would never, by any academic standards, hold up to being called a gospel or fit the gospel definition, Karen King was also a high-profile member of the Jesus Seminar, along with the previous guest of the show, Dr. Robert Price. Within days, however, the news cycle had moved in a very different direction. Many academics who might have had a say in a robust peer-reviewed discussion and process were excluded from the media push, and they raised serious questions that the papyrus fragment was actually a forgery. Skeptical discussions coalesced around Duke professor Mark Goodacre's NT blog and podcast and other online sources. I highly suggest you go back and listen to Professor Goodacre's 5-part series on this situation for a more in-depth discussion of the facts of the story. Goodacre wrote about the concerns of a UK professor who noticed extreme similarities between virtually all of the extant text in the Gospel of Jesus' wife and the already well-known non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, as though a forger had cut and pasted quotations to assemble something seemingly new. Independent scholar Andrew Bernhardt, all too accustomed to not being on the academia's radar, went into one shocking step further. He confirmed that the actual text of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was lifted from an online Thomas translation by another independent scholar, Michael Grandin, with all of the idiosyncrasies and even errors and typos intact. Finally, and most shockingly, was the issue of provenance. Just where had this papyrus fragment come from? King had received the artifact from a professional collector who had contacted her and who King said wished to remain anonymous. Journalist Ariel Sabar, author of the Smithsonian piece that accompanied the 2012 announcement, discovered that Walter Fritz, a German who had immigrated from Florida, was in reality an endless and fascinating and often perplexing con man. I mean, you really have to read the book to find out all the ins and outs of that story. Fritz, who was a frustrated Egyptology grad student back in Berlin way back in the early 90s, also wound up spending the decades after that as a machine parts salesman and an adult filmmaker. He never issued a direct apology or actually said that he did this forgery. But as detailed in Sabar's new book, Virtutes, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, hours of conversation with Fritz left little doubt that he had actually forged the documents and duped King and Harvard. There's just so much more with this story. We can't possibly get into all of it here. With that being said, though, let's get on with exploring at least a few of the issues brought up in this fascinating story of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. So just to set the frame of what we're talking about today, how did one of the most important and well-regarded professors in New Testament and religious studies get to this point in September of 2012, where she put out this document? She kind of did it in a half academic, half sensationalistic way. How did we get to this point? And how did a system that was really supposed to prevent this sort of sensationalized Indiana Jones style archaeological finds, how did it just fail so spectacularly? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Max, maybe just share a couple of your what were you thinking when you just originally heard this story, and even before you started digging into it, what were you thinking?
So I think to me the first real area of significance that this brings out a little bit from experience is the point where academia and the media intersect. And, as you said, Karen King makes this announcement at this symposium in Rome. Now, I'm not familiar with other things that have been announced at these symposia in Rome, each year. So why do we know about this? This turns out to be very important because Karen King had called a few major media news outlets, but to cover this announcement. And she was doing it for a finding that was written up in a journal article that had either not yet been peer-reviewed, which is usually in academia when a journal article is published, you have even double-blind peer reviewers from these journals out there. People say, what's the significance of these journals anymore when you have the web? Why do you need things published? Well, it's this curation, and it's people in your own field are supposed to, basically say, is this a good paper? Is this correct? And is this, interesting enough to publish? The irony, and this relates to some more recent developments in the relationship between academia and the media, is if you want something really reviewed by your peers and everybody else really closely, the best way to do it is to call up the New York Times and say, have I got a story for you? Before you do any of it. I have seen this again and again across fields, like several times, including several in my own. when people go to the media with major discoveries before they go through this peer review process, the peer review process is not sacred. It can be deeply problematic, but the people doing the review get ticked off. And it also becomes a big story. And because of all of the incentives involved, other people like you and me end up hearing about it. Now, maybe this is something to circle back to at the end, but you said, how did this system not work? Maybe this is how the system works at this point. But with the other point I wanted to make about academia and the media, and again, this is not that academia in its own bubble is sacred and infallible, nor should it, nor could it be. But that said, if I'm giving my findings to the media, if I'm doing research that mass media, social media, anything from the public is interested in, which I should be, by the way, people, I should be thinking about sort of important things. When I give that work over to the media, I can tell myself I'm telling them how to properly use it, right? King, in this case, says, very eloquently in this interview, this does not mean Jesus had a wife. Of course, this means some people a few hundred years later thought Jesus had a wife, right? But why are we all interested in it? At least me, it's the Jesus and the wife thing, right? Why is this the religious story I end up reading all the books about and talking to you about? This is stuff that sort of captures the public's imagination. Once academic questions are in the media, they're going to be simplified, misused, part of debates, and we sign a permission slip when we do that. And I think there was either some intentional naivete or not from Karen King about how this was going to be used, how this was going to be talked about. Again, another irony, there's too many ironies to count in this whole thing, but another irony is that by simplifying it, by making it interesting to people, it got a lot of other people interested and probably brought a lot of facts to the whole process at the end that wouldn't have been if the media wasn't involved. So it's a very interesting and complicated story.
I think that's the first thread we'll follow, because a lot of these things are kind of threads that go in parallel with each other. The big themes in this. And one theme I think is, and we may get it out of the way, is Karen King and this how this became sensationalized. And she kind of wanted to, my feeling was she wanted to have her cake and eat it too, that she wanted to portray herself as an academic that was just going to follow the truth. And she realized that this wasn't a slam dunk, that Jesus had a wife. But she kind of put it out there in the media that way, that this was an earth-shattering document, that it wasn't just a credit card-sized fragment of papyrus. She definitely put it out there that this was more than just something that was of minor interest to Coptic scholars. And I think that she must have known that the weight that she had, given that where she was academically as the Hollis Professor of Divinity, that when she comes out and makes a major announcement like that at the Coptic symposium in Rome, which probably 99.999 is stretch out as many nines as you want. The Coptic symposium in Rome is never going to make the news unless maybe something like there was a car crash or something there that would make it fit the news. So she must have known, given that she had this deal with the Smithsonian the Smithsonian magazine, that there was something going on that her naivete was maybe not maybe as naive as we think it is, that she was playing two sides of the field, that she was just the academic following the truth, but also that, this is a earth-shattering document.
Yeah, and I think I've characterized this to you in our conversations as kind of all too common in academia, and yet perhaps a particularly egregious and particularly a high-profile case of it. When we do things, and academic questions are always hard in a sense, or should be. Like that's why people are sucking up big endowments to sit there working on them. And as an economist, when we do academic work on policy issues, there's always a million unanswered questions and everything. But people are going to ask us, does the minimum wage reduce employment, and by how much, or what kind of monetary system should we have? And we're not going to give them the 60 pages of footnotes, and we are going to give them answers. And that happens. The problem is this statement that gets kicked around way too easily, which is we have to do our best. We gotta do something. And at times we have to instead of erring on the side of giving a simple answer, we have to err on the side of we don't know. They don't want the complicated answer, but we have to, we have to be the stewards of it. Now, Karen King essentially got this papyrus, and it's very interesting as you're reading yet another layer in this, as Ariel Sabar and his kind of perception of Karen King. It sounds like, I think an extremely interesting thing that he said was about the Da Vinci Code. So several years before this, Karen King kind of gained some prominence from the Da Vinci Code, right? She had been writing about these Gnostic Gospels and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene going back decades. But the original kind of History Channel documentaries that got made in the wake of the Da Vinci Code, Karen King is interviewed, and she's and Ariel Sabar, the author of Virtutes, says that what Dan Brown has said is obviously not true. There's a lot of inaccuracies in it. That she's not necessarily, she's kind of encouraging this stuff. And he says Karen King's whole career has been about dispelling fictions about Mary Magdalene. The problem she's confronted with is this particular fiction happens to coincide, happens to give her a platform to tell a different but related story that she's been spending her whole career trying to tell. And that's very hard to say no to. At the same time, right, the question, the issue of I'm gonna have it both ways. I'm gonna be this academic but engage in pop culture. In many ways, it's the pop culture that came back to bite her, not the academia. In this case, very interestingly, right? It's the friction between the two. But in the sciences, you've probably heard of something called the replication crisis. I can tell you from private sector work that goes into litigation that gets checked and double checked, people make mistakes in every field, and the peer review process in academia, across fields, across whatever you're doing, is not that great at catching them. And so this is something that is a hard sort of idea to face up to, because it potentially affects a lot of things. But in this case, and this is, you'll recognize from F.A. Hayek, one of my intellectual heroes, the idea of kind of dispersed knowledge here, that this story with pop culture resonance starts attracting the attention of people like the guy who coded all the letters of the Bible to have a translation algorithm. Quirky people who don't have academic jobs, but who are hobbyists who now, in this day and age, are allowed to be connected. The guy that the owners of the Hobby Lobby pay to, do work about the fragments they find and want to be saying something sort of opposite. All of these people get engaged here. And so in many ways, if there was naivete from Karen King, it may have been that in this day and age, some of this stuff doesn't fly anymore like it used to.
To follow up, the first thing you were talking about is really about pop culture and popularizing science. And I mean, we see it done so many times. It's done really well, and sometimes it's not done very well. Really, when something becomes popularized, it almost has to become sensationalized because the popularizer wants it to be seen by as many people as possible. And are there incentives today? I mean, obviously, there's incentives today to make things as sensational as possible. Is there a way that we can get around that, to not have things become so clickbait and obviously a gospel of Jesus's wife, you find a gospel, people are going to click on that. Is there a way that we can get around that whole culture that we've, gotten ourselves into?
So I wrote something a few weeks ago called The End of Consensus, which is, you talk about clickbait, ironically there, but the idea was that as we get to the point where everybody has a voice with social media, we're very concerned about how to aggregate these voices up to the right answer, and that we're not getting there. Whereas instead, I think we need to sort of disaggregate the questions. Let me explain what I mean here. When this is sensationalized, yes, our current system of great connectivity and social media sensationalizes things, provides more incentives than ever to sensationalize them. It also seems to provide checks and balances on that. And we often don't see that. We often look at social media and we see all of the very kind of petty micro-level fighting. As somebody who studies markets and competition and thinks of them primarily as a learning process for us and what needs to go where, all of that, if you zoom out a little bit, maybe looks like a better way to a richer, albeit more dispersed and diverse kind of truth here. So I think rather than finding a way around it, finding a way not to happen, part of it is to understand that it does happen and think more about the channels that, to me, again, this is the aggregated big question versus this large number of small questions. The tabloidy thing, like, was Jesus having sex with a woman, basically, is the problem here. But the solution turns out to be all of these other, quote, pop culture things like history podcasts. This guy with his translation interlineal, who's, like, not a lone wolf, but these, hobbyists. And that seems to be very helpful. So the more we empower the small but serious, we just have to realize we can't do that perfectly. So, we get a lot of voices, but it is a process that we don't fully understand yet, but that I think in the end is maybe better than having it hermetically sealed in academia.
And I think that that's where that date of 2012 really makes the big difference of when she released this, because it seems to me if she had released this maybe a decade before, it'd be a lot different of an outcome, and the media coverage would be a lot different. Maybe talk about some of those differences.
First of all, I was going to say earlier, the experts. We love talking about the experts. And remember that, and this is maybe something with a little perspective from having spent, several years in an academic department, as a graduate student. In this case, this is not just Karen King. This is Karen King, PhD students, journals, Harvard University, a PR office at Harvard University, the media, right? Just like everything, we ascribe a lot to Karen King, and yes, like the buck does stop with her ultimately, and it has to. But Karen King, it's easy for me at least to see how she could get swept up in a tide here. That doesn't mean she should, but it means she does. In terms of when this was released, this is just a prediction, but I think if this had come out in the mid-90s, early 90s, you're looking, it's still a pretty big news story, but not as big a news story at first, and then also not a disintegration either. This is probably something where, well, the academic debate rages on today, right? It's like something you would see how it would be described in the end here. I think that, and again, this is the fact that it's not like everybody has equal access. This is not some kind of kumbaya, perfect system, but the fact that all these people could find each other, that, Mark Goodacre's blog and, the guy with the interlineal and I'm blanking on, I'm terrible with names, but they find each other. And this is a different process, but this is a process, and it may actually be more robust at finding errors than just leaving things to the experts. So maybe in the end, our slightly different perspective is you're saying, well, if we can't trust the experts, and I'd say, well, no, you could never trust the experts, but maybe in the end you can trust the finished product a little bit more now. I hope, at least.
And I think that maybe the Karen King, because Karen King is not just the person Karen King, like you said, and I didn't think of it that way. She's all of the PhD students underneath her. Because she's the head of that department. She represents all of the professors who are under her. She's the Hollis professor of divinity school. She represents essentially Harvard. That maybe carried this story a lot further and got out from underneath her feet. They mentioned it a little bit in the book. There was another kind of forgery forged. It was the ossuary of Jesus, that it was a bone box that they used in Second Temple Judaism, that once a person decomposed, they would put their bones to save space. And it said like Jesus, brother of James, and like son of somebody, like perfect, like setup that this was Jesus's ossuary. Yet it was pretty much debunked really quickly because it didn't have a huge scholar behind it. I think the person who was pushing was a guy named James Tabor, who does not have the cred that Karen King has. Some big people or big institutions like the Israeli Antiquities Authority really quickly smashed down on it. It really wasn't a dispersed thing like that with the Karen King, which is something that maybe you can speak to, an authority versus what does that mean for us in this day and age where there's a lot more of this dispersed expertise?
Right. Well, I think my guess is if anybody, and this is pure speculation, but I'm quite confident in this speculation, Steve. If anybody from the Israeli Antiquities Authority is listening to this, they're chuckling to themselves, thinking about all the idiots they had to deal with on their work email and all the process, all the messed up ways that, the internal politics and the nepotism and right, it's probably a broken system like everything else is. The only difference is we don't know it yet. That doesn't mean that it's mostly not usually right. It means that all of these centralized things tend to have some of these issues. So, what this kind of wave of information technology of the last couple of decades does, I think, is primarily allow you to have some of the advantages of scale that you needed to have an antiquity authority or Harvard University or the U.S. government or things to have. But because of the way individuals can connect and communicate with each other, maintain some of that local niche kind of dispersed Hayekian, so to speak, focus at the same time. So if everybody reads this book and listens to these podcasts and hears this story thinking, okay, was Karen King a fraud or not? Right? That's the question we all want to know. And of course, it's not quite that simple. And my best answer, and again, this is not, this is only coming from me, but the way that she behaves to me did not look like somebody pre-planning fraud. The way she behaved looked like this was something it was appropriate for someone like Karen King to do. This is the level of preparation and checking of things. Oh, provenance, it's a big issue. Let's talk to my friend Walter Bagnall. Ah, this looks cool to me. Okay, great. Everybody wants it to be true. And the new so, I don't think it's that. I don't think she was thinking the whole time, this is false, let me keep a lid on it. I think she was behaving like someone who assumed that some of these things were just never going to be looked into. And not even thinking that, but just, never having had that result thrown in her face before. It is the fact that all of these different people with different ideas are empowered to look at this that really does it.
I think this is a difficult part of the story too, that both of us don't have any intimate knowledge of any of this. We're really getting the whole story through Ariel Sabar and Mark Goodacre and
right.
all these different articles that you read. And Ariel Sabar, he really paints I think maybe I love the book and I suggest everybody go out there and buy it. That he maybe one of my problems is that he plays a psychologist a little bit too much in the book, and so maybe that's something that colors my perception of Karen King. After reading it, maybe going into it, I wanted to believe that she was a fraud and that was pushing it, and I don't think that now. I think that Karen King strip away Hollis Professor and all of those titles that she has. Maybe Karen King as a person wanted to believe that this was true, and she got taken by somebody, a con man Walter Fritz, who we'll talk about, and it's really, we can never get into all of Walter Fritz here. It's so complicated.
There's as many rabbit holes there as you want to dive down if you're interested. It's all out there.
So trust us that he was, and Sabar would paint that picture, that he was a person who knew, Walter Fritz was a person who knew exactly how to get to the mark, you might say, of that he wanted to do. And maybe that Karen King, she made a mistake, and she did own up to her mistake in the end, and it did hurt her career she hasn't really published very much after that, and she's kept a pretty low profile since then. Is that an incentive enough for an academic to the chance that one mistake can ruin your career? You really can't protect yourself from that, really, in the end, in any profession.
Ultimately, this and again, when we think of this as an incentive, it's not an incentive for Karen King to think, yes, no, should I lie or not? That's never happening. But the question is, are stories like this incentive to do things like check the provenance, check the history of the document, be a little less obviously throwing your academic weight around as a superstar, that type of thing. And again, like I said, this is not a unique story in terms of going to the mass media first, even though, again, peer review in and of itself is not this pristine process.
Let's talk a little bit about Michael Grandin, because he comes up, and I think we were on the exact same wavelength with Michael Grandin. I'll just set him up. He's the one who came up with the Coptic interlinear that was used for this forgery. And I don't think Sabar he didn't really talk about this, but for me, it's a huge, as somebody who's a podcaster, who's an amateur, why don't you tell us a little bit about Grandin and set up his story?
Right. So I may I may be a little blurrier on some of the details of the story than you, but ultimately he was an amateur. I think not. Did he do undergrad in this field, or?
I think he very briefly. His story was he had academic inclinations, but I think at least the story Sabar put is like his father or something totally put the kibosh on that. And so he went and got like a completely practical job. I think he worked at an insurance agency or doing some like statistical analysis, but his passion was putting together an interlinear of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. And he made a website, and he used that as a way to do some sort of numerology of the document and to do some really bizarre data analysis of the document. Just to put it into context, because this is the mind-blowing thing. He did it in the 90s. Before anything like that, now if somebody did that, they'd get, I think I had said that, he'd get 100,000 views on his YouTube page doing a podcast about this. In 1997, he was a crank who was doing this in his basement with his wife saying, why can't we go on vacation because you're typing out code for your website? I think we agree. How much has Grandin and his story changed? If Grandin had been born 20 years later, what the differences would have been for somebody who has kind of a bizarre and unusual hobby and talent?
Yeah. Well, to me, even though he did this translation of the Gospel of Thomas in the 90s, and the interesting thing here is he's this sort of, not even frustrated academic, didn't even get to the point where he could be frustrated, has this little interest that some people would dismiss as kooky about kind of finding these codes. This sort of, as a tangential matter, has to almost do this weird translation of the Gospel of Thomas that it turns out that the forger in part ripped off, and this is how he knows this. So, people want, and this is when you had said earlier, because the internet, all this kind of trash can get out there along with the truth and all this stuff. The real way around that, so to speak, is to treat all of this disagreement not as opportunity for struggle, which is what we're used to doing, but treat it as an opportunity for learning, right? And so in the 90s, when this interlineal translation of Thomas was made, right, the only thing you had to know about Michael Grandin was he was trying to find some code in the Bible, right? He's some kook in his mother's basement, whatever, right? He still may have ideas that are kooky at this point, or interests that are very sort of focused and limited and idiosyncratic. But his existence in this world and his connection to this world and his ability to talk back to this world allow him to basically provide this information that only this kook in his mother's basement, which I really shouldn't be calling, that's not a fair characterization, but it can provide that before just never would have been connected.
Really, in a lot of ways, he's the driving force of this entire scandal, that it was his this guy who was doing this work in his basement, who was just following a passion that was really not even much to do with any passion about the Gospel of Thomas. Without that, this forgery may not have even happened. And without people knowing that his work is impacted the academic side of it, if people didn't automatically know his interlinear in and out, they would have never have seen that this was a forgery.
Yeah. It's... Again, these are the things that can never be planned, that when we just allow people to be connected and we listen and we do our homework and the stuff we're involved in terms of who we hear, who we talk to, and insisting on a standard of what's true and important and all of that, then the big picture takes care of itself. And then we don't have to worry about, well, how do we get the people we think are right to be the ones who are talking? We take that energy, and when it's our thing that we're interested in, whether we're a hobbyist or a professional, and the Michael Grondin thing comes along, we're able to take that and get what's important out of it. That's hopefully, and I think I'm optimistic, going to be the way a lot of things in academia shift. We may be in a weird time right now when all of this technology is kind of relatively new and we're still figuring out what it all means.
I think a good way to maybe a final point, and this is going to be a long final point, so everybody get comfortable.
There's a lot of points. It's incredible.
Mark Goodacre, who's a New Testament professor at Duke University, and he was he definitely did a great series on the nitty-gritty and the details of this forgery, and he was very much involved with a lot of the aspects being found as a forgery. At the end of one of his podcasts, he said how he felt honestly sad of all the hours that not only he spent on this, but probably literally years of time people spent on something that wound up just being a forgery, and how all that time could have been used more productively. And at first I was like, yeah, I absolutely agree with you that this was a waste of time. But then in another way, maybe this wasn't a waste of time, that a lot of really interesting points got brought out, and a lot of really interesting debate was brought out because of this forgery. And maybe there is something to learn from it.
So I'm gonna butcher a Frederick Hayek quote here, but to paraphrase it, we only use competition in situations where we do not know the essential features of the competitors, right? Goodacre is lamenting the way this situation turned out, but it was his work that helped the situation turn out in the right way. We can't go back and plan that out so that, everybody knows that this is a forgery, but it's going to be let through, but it's going to capture the public's imagination, but it's going to do this and that. He's taking sort of one bad outcome there, and I understand it. I understand the feeling of it, but In the end, I do think that a lot of this turns out to be the system working, or a new system finding out how to work.
Yeah, I think that just saying that had this not happened, then, the outcome would have been this. It really was a driver to a lot of interesting debate, and it opened up a lot of different avenues of discussion that wouldn't have happened. And the outcome didn't happen, that people believed that this was not a forgery. I don't think that it was ever going to be, at least the way it was portrayed, that this was ever going to be a forgery that would just skate through and enter the canon of things that were not forgery. I think since it was so quickly people figured out it was a forgery, and so many experts figured out it was a forgery, that it was never going to become accepted as a document.
No, that's interesting. And that may, I was talking a little bit earlier about how, a lot of these things were specifically detected because of this. It would be interesting to see what this would have looked like. I guess if the peer review process had ever done its job, it would have said no, but that's a whole other can of worms. In the end, we're always surprised that it's just a lot of human beings running around crashing into each other, messing everything up. It is. Even in academia, even at Harvard, even with Jesus and with or without his wife. It's a tremendously, for both Mark Goodacre's podcast and the Virtutes book, I had a blast with, and I recommend.
Yeah, I think definitely that 6-part series was absolutely a must listen to. And the book, I think, is a must read or listen to, whichever you prefer. Both, I have gotten so many hours of entertainment out of both of them.
Ditto, and me too.
I think one other thing, one last thing, is that the whole issue of provenance, and we can't get into all of it here, it's impossible. But that seemed like another thing that just was a very much a missed opportunity that Karen King and we've been saying, her whole team should have seen that there was a lot of major questions with provenance. And I think that maybe that's something even particular about these documents and antiquities in general, is they really, to be taken seriously, need to have squeaky clean provenance. And unfortunately, none of these things have squeaky clean provenance.
Right. That rules out a lot. And it's sort of like the way we wanted economics to become scientific and quantitative and mathy. Dan Carlin at one point raises a really provocative idea, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I don't think he did either, which is maybe history needs to now be 2 fields at this point. That back along, generations ago when Will Durant was talking about, this Mesopotamian civilization or that, got rich and soft, and that's why they declined. And we're ultimately, that's the kind of thing that would never pass muster today. But at the same time, do we lose something? And that goes for provenance, that goes for empirical economics, that goes, our standards for sort of accuracy get higher and higher, but they never get perfect. It's like, it's like whichever Greek was rolling the rock up the hill, and in addition to understanding the incredible things we can do, we have to understand the limitations, and not in a postmodern way, another thing that we say for another podcast, but we have to allow that none of us have a monopoly on the truth, and to let all of these things in.
Yeah, I think I mean, we're here. We might as well, it's a huge can of worms. Let's see where it goes. But I think that is something that is, maybe that's of where we are in the world in 2020, is that we demand scientific exactitude in everything. And as we're learning, there's less and less exactitude in science and just about everything else. That interpretation matters so much more. So subjectivity and objectivity, nobody can agree on anything.
Right. And again, it's a lot of that to me is because we're still asking questions, big questions that maybe made more sense in an era with mass media where most people couldn't communicate, and that sort of thing. All of these subjectivity, objectivity, postmodernism, objectivism, all of these very sort of laid out epistemologies, philosophies of what we do and don't know, in human hands 99% of the time end up with, I'm the one who's saying the thing that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can appreciate that there's too much information out there for one person to know, and that people's beliefs are going to be shaped by that path they take uniquely through it all, then it's not in a postmodern, well, what I feel like is right is the right thing. It's more points of departure, disagreement, differences in background, education. What can I learn from this? I don't have to put everything I believe on the line to listen. I can disagree. What can this process teach us?
So now that we've been talking about this, that there's so much more to go into, but I think we've really covered the main points here. What's your 2-second takeaway, and what should people maybe think about this, just to wrap it up before they go out and listen to those other episodes and read the book? How should they go into those?
2-second. Nobody has a monopoly on the truth, and everybody sort of assumes they do. So think about your own and all of these people's when you read it, and it's fascinating.
If people want to learn more about your work or anything that's coming up, where can they find out about that?
Yes, so I am with, as we said at the top, the American Institute for Economic Research. Steve is a friend of the Institute, I think, at this point. Myself, my colleagues, Jeffrey Tucker and Phil Magnus, have both been on the podcast in various combinations. We were founded in 1933. We're an economic research institute located in Western Massachusetts. We do a whole lot of writing aimed at people, I think, who would really enjoy it. People listening to this podcast, sort of a interested and educated, but not sort of wonky economist public. We write about a whole range of kind of current and historical topics. We have a lot of great articles and essays on our site. Again, there's a lot of vowels right in a row, which, in 1933, if I had to redo it, but AIER.org, the American Institute for Economic Research. You can, find all of my stuff there, my excellent colleagues, a lot of new content every day. I'm also on Twitter. It's MaxG-Econ. Again, that's Max, MaxG-Econ. On Twitter.
Well, thanks a lot again, and I'm sure you'll be back on the show again probably soon to talk about its
I'll
endless.
find some way. Exactly.
All right. Well, take care.
All right. Thank you.